What we're gonna do is to cover the subject of creating a turntable for your rocket. Okay, so I'm just gonna load this up again. Right, so we're gonna do the first part here, and then we're gonna go for a short 15-minute break, and then after that we come back and work on lighting and stuff. Okay, so I'm gonna create a donut here, and I'm gonna just rotate it 90 degrees in the x-axis. So make sure your Z is facing you. Okay, over here, the small guy here, make sure your positive Z is facing you, and rotate your torus 90 degrees. Okay, after that, do a save. I'm just gonna drop it on my desktop. So let's call this a turntable. So I'm going to bring this above the ground as well. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is to make sure that our low poly model is smooth. Okay, so inside our inputs, right, for your torus, can you make sure that the subdivision axis is 12? The height is also 12. Okay, so let's just make this low poly. So 12, 12. So it's a very low poly, just like your rocket ship. Okay, and what we're gonna do is to learn to make it look smooth. So instead of pressing 3 like we usually do, right? This is more for a smooth preview for actual high-res models that you want it to look good. But for games, right, we don't have that kind of luxury. How do we make it look smooth without adding additional lines? Okay, so if we go to, make sure you're in the modeling toolset. Okay, and if we go to mesh display, so this is a new menu that we haven't touched before. And I want to actually look at this section here. Okay, we got harden edge and we've got soften edge. So let's click on, let's select our mesh first, and we click on soften edge. Can you see straight away, right? Your donut looks very smooth. Okay, compared to before, this is before. Okay, we can see all the hard surface, and after, you don't really see much hard surface in between. The silhouette is definitely gonna be visible. Okay, but what's in between here is actually gonna be smooth. So it's actually like those kind of, you know, Dota and all those low poly models, right? If you zoom in, you can actually see that their silhouette is very, very jagged. It's just that because they painted it so well and they actually smoothed the model first, so it gives that impression that, oh, it's actually quite detailed, especially from far. But it's actually a very low poly model. Now, what happens if you need to sharpen an edge? You know, your rocket ship had parts that are sharp, right? So you just want to go to mesh display and choose harden edge. Okay, then you can see straight away the edge here is very, very sharp. Later on when we play with like the lighting, right, it will be even more obvious. Okay, maybe I'm going to sharpen edge in the top here, so that when we do lighting, we're going to see it even more. Can you see that? Okay, I'm going to soften this one. Right? Okay, so what I did was I just hardened the edge of the rings, so that when we add some lights, you're going to start seeing all these things showing. So for your rocket ship, right, let's say that you guys have already Okay, you guys have already done some some like edge tightening with edge loops. So let's say you insert edge loop and you started to do some of this refinement, right? So what I will need you to do is to actually remove it. Alright, and instead we are gonna harden the edge. So just actually for cube you don't see much lah. Okay, it's already hardened. Alright. So especially for all these rounded objects, if you need to harden the edge, instead of using edge loop, start to use the harden and soften edge instead, so you can keep your poly count low. Okay, now let's move on to turntable. So we're gonna animate our torus, right, to start spinning 360. Before we do that though, we need to make sure that our model itself is clean. What do I mean by clean? It means that it does not have any inputs. The history is cleaned off. Our values here in the transform is reset to 0. So remember I said that if you have some weird values here, for example 3.999, right? Oh, okay, 4. Every time when you want to rotate 360, you must remember to add the 4 back. So 364 in order for it to spin a full 360. So it's going to be very troublesome. And you even notice that it rounds up the value. So you don't even get the exact value. You don't even see it being, 3.999. So what we need to do is make sure that this is fully reset to 0, so that when we animate, right, our numbers are very, very clean. We can see things very, very easily. So what we need to do first, okay, let's delete the inputs, okay, to make sure it's very, very clean, so that when we start rotating and we start passing our models to somebody else to, let's say, rig or animate, there won't be any strange problems that come up later on. Okay, so select your torus, and under edit, you see a lot of like the delete group, right? So we have 3 different types of delete. I'm going to delete by type, history. Okay, of course you can delete all by type. All means it's going to delete everything in your scene, as in it's going to delete all the history for all the objects. Very dangerous, I would say, because sometimes there are certain things that you might still want to keep the history to edit. You're in the process of still doing your work, right? So you want to do delete by type. So you actually select the ones that you want to clean. Okay, so this is usually the safer mode. Okay, and this is undoable, right? So make sure you save a copy first before you delete history. I mean, it's undoable once you save it. So that means if you save over your work, right, and then the next time you open it, you will never see your history again. So make sure you have another version. Okay, now let's clear out these transforms. So let's go to let me see, modify. Remember modify where we center our pivot, correct? So we have something called freeze transformation. So we have this whole set of transformation stuff, but we're going to look at freeze transformation. So freeze transformation is going to get rid of all the values here. Reset, on the other hand, right, reset transformation is going to move your object back to the original created spot, right, or the original pivot. But freeze transform is going to leave it there. It's just going to clear out the values. Okay, so you can see now I have a very, very clean model, right? Nothing there. Okay, shall we do another duplicate of Command D or Control D? Okay, let's make sure that it's up to you whether you want to scale it up, you want to rotate. Remember our rocket, we have more than one piece, right? So let's just create another part for it. Okay, so duplicate your torus and make sure you also freeze transform for torus 2. So we have a double torus. Now we're going to take this whole thing, right, and then we're going to spin it 360. But if you try to spin, right, you will notice that each of them are spinning their own way and it's not really spinning together as one object. So if you're going to take your whole rocket, right, and try and spin, all your parts are going to come off. Okay, because each of them has their own pivot point. And when you try and rotate them together, they are actually rotating around their own individual pivots. So that's not going to really help you. So what we need to do is to group both torus together so that we will rotate that group itself. Okay, so if you select your two torus, press Command G, or if you forget the shortcut key, it's over in Edit. Okay, so under Edit, you can see Group and Ungroup. Alright, it's all there. So select the two torus, press Command G. Let's name our group Turntable GRP for group. So, and you notice that once we have our group selected, how do you open this outliner? Remember this small little guy at the side, okay, that you can turn on and off? That's your outliner, right? You can see everything in your scene. And we're going to work a lot from this window today, right? So now we have our group selected, right? Once you try to rotate, you can see a difference. Everything starts to rotate from the same pivot point. And the pivot point is actually in the origin of the world space, right? Okay, you guys can also center pivot if you want to. So if you want your pivot to be in the middle of the group, okay, you can apply a center pivot. Just make sure that your group is selected, because in your scene, right, when you try to select them, they are still selected individually. So you need to go to your outliner and select the group itself. Okay, once we have this guy, we can start to animate. Okay, so our turntable, the group, right, is very clean. There's no history. Okay, there's no transformation. It's very clean, right? So we don't really need to freeze transform for it. Now, what we need to do before we start animating is to make sure that we have a camera angle set up properly. No point you animate, right? And then you realize, it's off cam, okay? Or the main action is so big, it's out of the frame. Especially if you have a background. Okay, so you need to frame it in a certain way and your character starts to move off camera and you didn't realize it until after all the work is done. So let's make sure we have a nice camera angle. We're going to create a default, yeah, record? Yeah. Okay, we're going to create a default camera for animation. So let's go to create cameras and I'm just going to choose the first one. And it says camera 1, right? So of course you can rename it, but I'm just going to leave it as cam 1. Okay, you can see your camera is being created, but then even if you try to move and rotate, you are not seeing the actual view, right? So we need to transform this panel from perspective here. Right now in our perspective camera, we want to transform it to camera 1. So all these buttons here belong to your panel. You can adjust how you want your panel to look and feel. For example, if you were to go to 4 view mode, right? This button at the side, you can see that each window has its own panel menu. and you can kind of customize how each of the panels look like. So for now, right, I'm just going to go to panels, okay, and under perspective, because our camera is a perspective camera, it's a 3D camera, it's not really an orthographic. Orthographic means it's 2D, cannot be rotated. Okay, so ours is a 3D camera, so it's over here, camera 1. So when you click on it, you can see that it tries to frame your object, right? It was the position where it created. So if you use your normal move rotate tool, you are essentially moving your camera. So I'm going to open up, you don't have to follow this part, but for me it's a bit more convenient to show you what I'm trying to do. Okay, so I just open up a tool panel and I switch one to camera 1, the other one to perspective. So I have two views. I'm just going to show you what happens when I try to rotate my camera. So you can see, right, under my camera 1, if I try to rotate, my camera is actually moving. See that? So that's why when you're in camera 1, right, you're actually positioning the camera itself. Okay, great. Now we have a view, but actually it's still not very accurate, because if you were to resize your window, right, you can make your panel square, you can make your panel like a handphone, like portrait mode, you can make it landscape. So you don't exactly know yet if it's in frame or not, right? So we need to have some feedback, okay? So what we need to turn on next is something called the resolution gate. See this little like circle here? So if you turn it on, this guy, you can see that now you are able to see the size of your frame. And on top here it says 960 by 540. That is the size of your image that's going to come up, and the size of your movie clip, for example. Okay, so make sure that when you frame your stuff, you frame it with some spacing. So you want all your main action to happen with a little bit of gap at the sides. Okay, you don't want it to be like exactly clipping like this. Okay, this is not good, because if let's say you have another device, or actually nowadays it doesn't really happen anymore. On old TVs, right, they used to cut off some parts of your video, or let's say you were to ship your animation or your show, right, to another country, and let's say that the TVs are still the older TVs, some of the TV stations might cut off part of your widescreen video so that it can fit onto their TV screen, their 4:3 TV. So instead of a landscape, right, they might cut off so it's a bit more squarish for the older TVs. Then you will start losing informations at the sides. So you must always make sure, right, that you have a little bit of space. Okay, to apply for our digital era, right, nowadays it doesn't clip off, but then to have that space, right, is still a bit easier for the eyes, because if you go all the way here, it's very tight, okay, and it feels very claustrophobic. So make sure you just have that little bit of space going on. Okay, 960 by 540 is too small. Okay, so we're gonna go to HD size. So in order to change the size of our frame, we want to open up something here. So if you can't see this button, you need to expand your window a little bit. This is called the render settings button, and we are constantly gonna go back to it every time today in this class. So this is gonna set the settings for the image that it generates outside of Maya. So you want the final movie, or you want the final picture that you want to take out from Maya itself, you want to come to this setting here. Okay, so this is called render settings. Render means you generate an image that you can display in everyone's com, right? So it's like a picture of your 3D stuff. So let's ignore everything else, but we want to make sure that we have the size correct. So if you scale down, right now it says HD 540. Okay, so that's quite old. Let's move on to HD 1080. So right now our HD is already 1080 by 1920 by 1080. That's the size of most of your YouTube videos, okay, your TVs, and your computers. Computers are actually higher, but then this is the standard for videos. Okay, so obviously we're moving to 4K videos now, right? So in the future, probably Maya will update to 4K for us. So right now, 1920 is the common. Okay, so we have the correct size, 1920 by 1080. We have our camera view set up. Every time you notice, every time when we rotate, right, we lose our view, right? And it's very easy to just flick your mouse and get it out. So what we need to do is we need to lock this down, lock our camera down, so that we don't have the problem of losing our view. So can you choose like an optimal view? Okay, I'm just gonna do it. Okay, maybe I'm just gonna do it slightly rotated like that. Okay, and make sure you select your camera 1, and we want to set a keyframe. Keyframe meaning it's really an animation keyframe. Okay, we want to lock it down so that even though we rotate our camera, we can still go back to the original position. So what do I mean by that? Can you see this timeline here? Okay, so this is the thing that we're going to use a lot for our turntable. So this is the timeline that contains the number of frames. Okay, so frame 1, 2, 3, so and so forth. So how many frames make 1 second? 24, good. So if let's say we want to make a 6-second turntable, how many frames would that be? 24 times 6 seconds is 144, right? Yeah, okay. So we're gonna set that later on. So let's just put our keyframe. Let's drag it to 1. Okay, and I'm gonna just press S. Okay, so select your camera 1. Press S. It's gonna create a keyframe on the first frame. If you create wrongly, you can always right click, delete, okay, or you can always cut, copy, alright? In order to move it, just shift click and then you can move. So shift click and drag, right? It's kind of like highlighting the area. Shift click and drag, and then you can start to move that selection. Okay, so if you want to select just one, you can just shift click and then you can drag it. So that's how you move your keyframe. At the bottom here, we have 2 numbers, 1, 1. We have this like a slider thing here, and then we have another 2 more numbers, right? So the first 2 numbers, the first one shows the start of your animation. The last number shows the end, actually the end of the timeline. Okay, so the start of the timeline 1, the end of the timeline, which is 200. Okay, the inner numbers, the one that's somewhere in the middle, like 1, and this part also 200, right? This one shows you what is being shown in the timeline. For example, if I were to drag the buttons here, I'm kind of like zooming in and out of the timeline. Can you see that? Kind of like magnifying what I see. So you can also see that the numbers here the inner numbers reflect what you see in your timeline. So the inner numbers are really just to show you what you're zooming in. I don't really use that a lot. I use the sliders instead to kind of visually zoom in. Okay, but I will use this to set my furthest. So let's say just now we talked about 144, right? So you can key in 144, and then you kind of change the range from 1 to 144. So some of you might ask me for animation, right? I usually, do we start on frame 1 or do we start on frame 0? So it depends on, actually it depends on the company and the animator. Like I've spoken to my friend who's actually an animator, right? And he says that it's actually quite subjective. It means there's actually no hard and fast rule like should you start on 1 or should you start on 0. Some prefer to start on 1 because you will end on 24, right? Some will prefer to start on 0 so that 24 itself is the 1 second. So it's really, I think it's a matter of preference. So far he hasn't given me a very fixed answer to say no, we start on 1. So it's really dependent on the company, how they operate, you know. And of course it's also dependent on, if you work on your own, right, it's your own preference. So we'll just leave it as that. Okay, over to your right side, all these are your play buttons. So you can play forward, you can play backwards, you can step forward 1 key. So this one will jump to your keyframes. This one will jump by frame. Okay, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of mouse over, you can mess around and check it out. This number here tells you where's your selection. So for example, now I'm at 70, right? It's going to reflect 70. That's all. Okay, so it's nothing too complicated about this. And of course, the animation settings is this running man here. This is where you can set up your animation settings. Your render settings is here, right? Your final image is up here. Okay, so now we have set a keyframe for our camera. If you try to rotate and move your stuff, okay, you might think that you lose your framing, right? All you need to do is just scrub it and you get back your view. So every time you set keyframe, it's kind of like locking it in place. So when you scrub it, it will just get back to where you are. Cool? Of course, there are other ways to lock down a camera. There's definitely more than one way of doing the same thing. Let's just do something that you will get to use often. For example, right now we're doing animation, so to lock it down with keyframe is one of the more sensible thing to do. Okay, so you don't have to learn too much at one go. Okay, now using the same concept, we are going to animate the turntable. Okay, so I'm going to select my turntable group. I'm going to go to frame 1, and instead of pressing S, right, because when you press S, I'm going to show you what happens. Okay, when you press S, the whole channel box gets turned red. This red markings means that there's a keyframe. So it's keyframing all the position, all the rotation, or the scale, right? Which is very good for our camera. But for our turntable, right, we want to keep things simple and only keyframe what is needed. So that when you adjust things, right, you will notice that when you adjust something and it acts weird because other things are actually being keyframed also. So you want to know exactly what you are framing. Okay, so you give yourself maximum control. So you know nothing weird goes on. Okay, so let's right click rotation Y, and we're going to choose key selected. Okay, once you select key selected, you realize that it is red, right? And it's only one spot, which is rotate Y. Now let's go all the way to 144 at the end. Okay, obviously you can key in 144 if you want to. then in rotate Y, I'm going to type 360 and key select again. Okay, make sure you keyframe again so that there's a red line here. And when you scrub your timeline, you should see that it turns 360. Okay, so we have our spinning camera, our spinning object. Now we want to make sure that what we are viewing, right, the speed of our animation, when you press play, is gonna be accurate. So this play button for your default settings is gonna play every frame, meaning that whether your comm is lagging or is working at super speed, right, it's gonna play every single frame. So if your comm is lagging, it's gonna force to play every frame slowly. And if your comm is very fast, right, it's gonna play every frame very quickly. So in other words, right, what you're seeing is not what you're getting, okay, because your comm might be slow today and things like that. So let's go to our running man, our animation preference. Okay, so click on the running man, and under your animation preference, this window, by the way, this is your preference window, right? It can be found under your window settings and preference as well. So it's the same thing, okay? It's just that it's a bit easier to find with the guy there. Okay, our frame rate, make sure it's 24 frames per second, right? The rest can be default. Now, this is the one that we want to check. So by default, yours is playback speed, play every frame, right? So you want to change it to ×1. That means it's actually playing in real time, in the correct timing. So it will drop frames. If your comm is lagging, right, it will just drop the frame so that it still plays within 6 seconds. But then if you do every frame, right, it might play in 8 seconds if your comm is lagging, or it might play all these frames in 3 seconds if your comm is very fast. So, not helping, okay? So this one, save. Okay, so when you play, you might realize that if your comm is lagging, you might not be able to see some details, or you know, some things are it's still very dependent on how your computer performs. So let's look at another preview of the animation that is more accurate. It's actually a video format, okay, that you can see how the end result is. And if you are working in animation studios, right, usually you need to provide all these movie clips, these preview movie clips for your team to feedback. So your director will kind of cut all these things together, compile it into a final movie, and use that as a way to preview how your whole movie looks like. So it can't be possible that he open up every Maya file and then he go and check everything, you know. So we need to see everything in one big movie clip, right? So how we do that is under animation. So you must make sure that we switch to our animation modeling menu set. And under playback, let's click on something called Playblast. So what Playblast does is it takes a screenshot of every frame and turn it into a video. So if your window, right, is very small, for example, if your window is okay, let me just scale down my window to show you. Okay, if your window is this tiny, right, and then you do a Playblast, it's gonna come out really, really tiny. So it's actually a screenshot version. So let's make it as big as we can. You can close the outliner if you want to. Do a Playblast. Okay, and you can see that your window is bigger. It's still not the same size, right? Because you can tweak the settings. You can tweak it to be at scale 1, for example. So I leave the settings to you. Okay, you can change the quality, you know, you can check whatever that you want. So I'm not gonna talk too much about Playblast. Playblast is essentially just very functional for you to see the end result. So with our video here, just play and do a quick check. This is actually how your final video is gonna be. Meaning that, not like that, but the speed of your animation, right? This is a preview of how your final animation will look like. Okay? So obviously you can put it on loop. So I'm just gonna loop this guy. Okay. And just play. Those of you who are using Windows COM, right? When you play Blast, you might not find your file is opening up. You can actually force it to save somewhere. So under your settings, you can choose to save your file on your wherever your documents, desktop. Okay, and then you just go there and retrieve it. Yeah, guys, when you're doing a loop, right? What is wrong with your turntable? Yes, it's turning 360. Yeah, correct. It pauses at the end, right? So we need to make sure that it kind of spins seamlessly. We're going to spin 1 round only. But if you want it to spin like 2-3 rounds, right, we can do it in After Effects. So we don't have to do it in Maya and ask Maya to keep generating the image, because each image is going to take time to generate in from the 3D work. Okay, so 1 spin is enough. We're going to do the rest in Adobe. So let's fix this spin so that every time it loops back again, it doesn't have that weird pause. So shall we select our turntable group? So make sure you select the group itself, because that one has animation value. And then we're going to go to something called a graph editor. So we're going to look closely at our animation. And we're going to see that what is wrong with the twinning, okay? The way it animates from one keyframe to the other. So we know for sure that our keyframe has no problem, right? The first one is 0, the last one is 360. It's not an issue. It's more like the in-between is not really behaving the way we want it to. Okay guys, so how do you read this graph editor? Horizontally is your timeline, 0 to 144. Okay, so this is your time. Vertically, this is the value. So let's say we have rotation Y, right? If you only keyframe rotation Y, you have 1 channel here. But if you keyframe everything, like for example our camera, if we keyframe everything, you're gonna see everything here. But if you only keyframe 1, you're gonna see 1 channel. So whatever that's animated, right, the channel is gonna show up. So we have our first keyframe at the bottom. We have our last keyframe on top. Not an issue with the keyframe. What is the problem is the curve, right? The splining. So what happens is that there's not much change in the rotation here. So over time, right, for the first 20 frames, there's very little change. So it's kind of like very slow rotation. And then suddenly it speed up very constantly. And then it starts to slowly rotate to 360. So from here, right, it's like 320 to 360. The 40 degrees turn is very slow. You know, it's taken like 20 frames to do it. So what we need is a constant, is a straight line. So that it's constantly changing. Okay, so how do we change our keyframe so that it splines correctly? Can you click and drag to select the start and the end keyframe? So it should be white, right? So click and drag. And up here are the different splinings. So we want to click on the linear tangent, the 4th one, so that the tangent itself is straight like that. Okay, so you get a very straight spline across, right? So once we have a linear here, you can close this guy for good. Okay, because we are not really animating. We will come back to him again in assignment 2. When we do more animation, that's when we have to tweak our tangents a bit more. Okay, so now when we play again, you might not see it very clearly, so you might want to Playblast. Usually I rely more on Playblast rather than a playback. But of course, if I'm lazy, I will do a playback and then try and see. Okay, but you need to do a final Playblast to confirm. Okay, so just do a Playblast and check. And now you can see that even though it's rotating slower, right? But it's very, very constant. So let's do a loop. Okay, play. Can you see that? We have not much of an issue right now, right? If your pivot, right, is not in the center of your object, that means your turntable pivot is off center. You notice that your object is spinning like in a off center way. It will start to move. But if it's right in the middle of your object, it will spin correctly. Okay, so now we have our turntable. So just now I talked about pivot, right? So once again, those of you who didn't catch it, if you need to change your pivot point, click on your turntable group and then just go to modify center pivot. So it's right in the middle of your object before you rotate.